So welcome, friends. Welcome to the beginning of our church calendar. I know our wall calendars don't roll over till January the 1st, but in the world of Christian faith and liturgy, today is the beginning of the new cycle, and we call it Advent, which simply means the beginning. Each year, the players or the people through whom we relive our story, our favorite story, they change slightly, but only slightly. It's the same shocking story of divinity, of eternity being suddenly found in us, found in the most unlikely of places. It's the story of that eternal shoot, that divine sprout, breaking up through the parched soil of a conquered people. And Advent comes first because if we ever lose track of that simple truth, the rest becomes unintelligible. We must begin here again and again. God's birth is the epicenter of our story, as you know, and if we follow it all the way out to its logical ends, it's the story of a world made one. I'm guessing you know the characters already. Generally some combination of John the Baptist, Mother Mary, often the shepherds, sometimes Isaiah, or perhaps Jeremiah, bookended by the surprising and comforting voices of Persian priests from across the nearly unending desert. And part of our challenge each year as Christmas people is to read the same old story but with fresh eyes, to find newness in withered things. Our work is to continue to see ever-unfolding beauty in symbols and characters that we've known all our lives. It's not unlike relationships, I suppose. Take marriage, for example. The novelty always wears off. The great work of marriage is to continue to find beauty and magic in that same person about whom you already know nearly everything. Only we know that's actually a myth. Does anyone know as much about another person as they sometimes, however foolishly, but sometimes are willing to believe? I doubt it. Truth is, I've never woken up beside the same woman twice, which is a commentary about the enduring and unfolding mystery of the one woman that I adore, the one who is every woman in the world to me, to quote that song from the 70s. Like the mercies of God, or the evidence of unconditional divine love, my girl is actually brand new every day, which is partly why I love Advent. It's the challenge. I suppose I enjoy doing my best to find something new and something familiar and something ancient. Anyway, we're back where we started now. The Christmas story is our story, but it isn't only ours. It doesn't belong, I should say, to us, at least not to us exclusively. It actually belongs to everyone, which is why we're still talking about it. What makes a thing real, what defines something as true, is the fact that it travels well across the time-space continuum, across cultures and continents and cosmologies. The enduring stories, the true stories, find trace amounts of organic resonance, call it native harmony, already in the air, already in the soil, already in the hearts and the bellies of all souls it comes in contact with. Now, it feels important to point out that believers didn't always think of the Christmas story this way. We generally use our hands to clasp and to grasp, not to release, which is what they were actually designed to do best, release. We were taught Jesus was our property, our quarterback, our right-wing striker, our pole position driver. But even though most of us started out with this assumption in the beginning, that was never entirely true. The deeper truth is our awareness of the universe, of the universal nature of Jesus the Christ, our most pristine revelation of God and ourselves, has been slow to germinate in us. Embarrassingly, it hasn't taken centuries. To be honest, it's taken millennia. But now we're beginning to wake up. We never owned this story. This was never our baby in the manger. This was always everyone's baby. So as we reset the year together today, as we pump some fresh air into the lungs of an old story, as we dial in again the incarnation, as we release once more the limits of our limited thinking, as we surrender the myths of our mythology, we are forced to let go of Jesus and all that we thought we knew in exchange for a surprise of another layer of us revealed to ourselves, which of course is easier said than done, I know. But lend me your open heart and your childlike imagination this season as we look again at what it means that the maker of all things was able to dwell fully alive in the skin and bones of an ancient man born to a child mother named Mary. God was in Jesus, like God is in you. Turns out, eternity can be found in all of us. It isn't the quaint little history of Jesus that goes boom. Rather, it's the universality of the man, any baby born, that demonstrates what can actually be true for all of us, male, female, and beloved persons non-conforming it can be true for all of us in all places at all times. Now, it just so happens, this has been a year of massive upheaval, terrible and terrific growth, of frightening and fantastic new freedoms, which means, I hope, that I have some new space in my heart for something new to take root this Advent season. You might call it hunger or thirst, possibly desperation, maybe exhaustion, or just midlife. Recent happenings in my inner world have hollowed out some new capacity, some new space, which is how losses become gains. It's how death becomes new life. It's how new beginnings give way to endings, which give way to new beginnings. It's because of what floods in behind things recently deceased or just released, either way. You might call it revelation or awareness or deepened consciousness or just love. It only occupies spaces previously occupied by lesser things, you see. The good news is this newness appears to be nearly inexhaustible. It feels unending, like pure energy with no discernible point of origin. It's what all of this, the cosmos, is made of. Pure energy, pure potential. It only requires space to do its thing. And that's everybody's story on a grand scheme, almost too big to comprehend. So how might we make this granular enough? How can we get close enough to it to understand? Well, the central metaphor of Advent will work just fine. It takes a womb to produce new life. You see, supply has never been the issue. The issue has always been one of vacancy or space for something new to occur right where something was, space recently unoccupied by lesser things. And that's your warning, as well as our direction for this season. You'll be hearing this thought loop a lot in the next few weeks. Lesser things or lesser stories giving way to bigger things and bigger stories, or simply our story giving way to everyone's story. The truth is, this is a principle of the circle of mutual empowerment that Jesus bore witness to, or you could use the language of the kingdom of heaven if that still works for you. Let me tell you a brief story. Maybe it'll help embody the principle that I'm trying to describe. Everything grows in Houston, which might be literally the only thing I love about Houston. I've always loved banana trees, and growing up on the Pacific coast of Mexico, they were everywhere. So I bought a small reject banana sapling in a bucket for $10 on Highway 45. It was a runt of a thing at the end of the growing season, but I had a secret. I knew just a spot for it in our tiny backyard, just a spot for it to thrive. The previous week, you see, I had discovered just under the thick Augustine grass the decayed remains of an old tree. It must have been a huge tree planted right in the corner of the deck to shade the dining room from the relentless Houston afternoon sun. Anyway, that's where I planted that $10 runt of a reject banana tree. And by the end of the following growing season, that little titan was 9 full-size trees, which produced a delicious crop of bananas by the second year and shaded the living room. Why? Well, because new things thrive where old things were, you see. It seems to be a principle of the earth that feeds and nourishes us. And this, I believe, is why unbelieving is so essential to faith. Listen to me closely, friends, who are already deep in the throes of faith deconstruction. Deconstruction frees up an enormous amount of new space in our lives. You see, dogmatically held beliefs are to the heart what videos are to your cell phone or big trees are to your backyard. They take up a ton of space, which means updating them or uprooting them frees up a lot of bandwidth, a ton of capacity for new things to thrive in fertile spaces. Now, when you pull up roots, the roots of your faith, the faith of your youth, or call it the faith of our fathers, new things can explode in new life. Things previously held as certain, previously rooted, once released, loosen up a lot of soil. Soil where beautiful new life can take root in broken ground. Think about it. This is exactly what the Advent story is about. Neither Mary nor Zechariah nor the camel-mounted Zoroastrian priests could make room in their hearts for the miracle of God's enfleshment without first releasing, to whatever degree possible, their previously held hopes and cosmovision. I think the simplest way I can say it is this: ashes make wonderful fertilizer. I wonder if, together, we could find some ashes, some fertile soil, some fresh perspective inside our oldest story this Advent season. Well, let's turn our old story over again in our hearts and minds and see what we can see. I'm going to read the opening Advent 1 text from the 18th chapter of Luke. It may sound familiar to you. It reads like this. Under the subheading, The Coming of the Son of Man, Jesus says, "There will be signs in the sun, in the moon and in the stars and on the earth, distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Verse 27, then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, stand up, raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Yeah, so that's a pretty dark and bleak opening story for the Christmas season. I might summarize it this way, simply by saying, even when things appear impossible and terrifying, look for a new beginning. Stand up, look up, newness is on the horizon already. Jesus goes on to describe the lesson of the fig tree in verse 29. Then he told them this parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. In other words, look at any tree. As soon as they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is already near. In other words, trees speak to change. They announce it if we know what to look for. And I think Jesus probably recognized that look of bewilderment on the faces of his audience at that time. So he made it really, really simple. And he simply says, think about trees, friends. Y'all know how to read those. Verse 31, he goes on, so also when you see things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. In other words, when you sense something coming to an end, that happens right before something new is about to be born. There's a sequence here. Let that be your reminder that all things come back around in time. Verse 32, truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Newness, he seems to be saying, isn't all that hard to figure out, you guys. It seems to suggest that there's this almost this spinning wheel. It comes in predictable cycles. New follows old, follows new, follows old, which followed new at some point, which followed old at some point. And then these final thoughts under the subheading, exhortation to watch. Jesus says, be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, and that day does not catch you unexpectedly like a trap. For it will come upon all who live on the face of the whole earth. Be alert at all times, praying that you may have the strength to escape all these things that will take place and to stand before the Son of Man. In other words, learn to read the signs, new and old, come around in predictable cycles. Don't let that be a mystery to you. Follow along and be comforted by the predictability of new life springing from places where old things were. Okay. So as you can see, this isn't a very hallmarky text. It's dark and stormy. It's a dark and stormy way to begin the Advent season. But I think, if we're honest, we can identify with the deep desire for new life that Jesus was tapping into in his audience. Jesus seems to suggest that if we're looking in the wrong place, we may never see this newness that he predicts. Now I'll be the first to admit, apocalyptic language like this is a little shocking to the ear. I think Jesus spoke this way because he was born among the vanquished peoples, the refugees, among the people trying to survive on the margins. Empowered cultures like our own never generate much in the way of apocalyptic imagination. Why would they? They would most likely represent the loss of their collected goods and privilege. No, we don't dream of apocalypse. Apocalyptic or end-time imagination is generally born in suffering. We, the empowered, the culturally centered, should feel a bit of terror and insecurity at such visions. We may not be reading it correctly if we don't. But I think the key lesson here we can pull from this bit of disturbing discourse attributed to Jesus in the memory of John at least, is the comfort of understanding the sequence of things. We can miss it if we want. We can even dismiss it if we're so inclined. But this is the point. Ends give way to new beginnings. And that's not just true for us, the devoted followers of this wisdom teacher. This is actually everyone's reality. It's everyone's story. Unending newness is the heritage and legacy of every living thing on this bit of spinning stardust. Granted, this presupposes a certain posture towards release and loss of control and the demolition of privilege. But if we can grasp that simple technology, the technology of letting go, we can access our divine right, which is what? It's newness, rebirth, resurrection, to borrow from the language of the Apostle Paul, or just simply a tender new shoot bursting up from something dead, to borrow from Jesus' metaphor in today's discourse. Remember, Advent is about new beginnings, about starting over, All things, all events, however dark and desperate, however bleak and anxiety-producing, can lead to moments of new birth if we can only release what we're holding so tightly and let fresh seeds fall into new spaces to explode in new growth. Oh, friends, these words excite me. I'm describing our reality, our relationships, even our ever-evolving journeys of faith. I'm describing all of it. Every last bit, friends. New things emerge where old things were. In conclusion, I wonder if you can see this immense new vision of the cosmos. This is the heartbeat of Advent. Everything, anything, courses with new life. It throbs with divine newness, if only it can be released. Death, as it turns out, is painful, but it's also a doorway to newness. Hope is built in. We just need to be reminded. And when things feel dead or desperate, when you arrive at the bitter end of a thing you love, just know that you can be sure that newness comes next if you can manage to let it go. As Ray LaMontagne writes, green to gold and gold to brown, leaves fall to feed the ground. It's that simple. And if you ever misplace that expectation, that ancient embodied sense of awareness, which, by the way, we all do almost daily, if you ever misplace that, if you ever get lost along your way, just look at the fig tree or the banana tree. Either one will work. So be ready. Don't despair if you're currently losing something that you love. My question is simply, what might rise in its place? Remember, the best apocalyptic visions are born in suffering, and I know you're suffering, and the truth is, so am I. So together, let's allow that pain to be redeemed. Let's let it be turned into something new. This isn't our story, friends. This is the story of everyone and everything everywhere. Ask a gardener or a mother. Pain and loss aren't the end. They're the sacred and ancient gateway to a new beginning. Welcome to Advent.